So picking up in Quest for Truth from where we stopped last time, um, a new education of the heart is India's piteous need. Um, that was Sri T.L. Vaswani stating that. And yet, I, this is Irene speaking again, and yet I must admit that in all my varied travels in the past, I have never met in the West such wholehearted search for God. To explain what I mean, there is an illustration of this point by quoting from an article written by, whoops, scroll, written by Sri Vaswani's nephew, Jashan Vaswani. Jashan writes that as a college student, he had an exceptionally good opinion of himself. For that is what modern education so often does to one. In those young days, he recognized none as wiser than himself, till he met a man who changed his life. To follow Jashan's own words, quote, he looked like a simple villager. His clothes were of coarse, hand-spun khadar. His hair was disheveled gray. But there was something in his large, luminous eyes and in the smile which played upon his lips that drew me irresistibly to him. And stopping in my tracks, I gazed and continued to gaze at his illumined face. An influence flowed out of him. It enveloped me, and I felt like one spellbound. Then it then it was that, for the first time, I knew what it was to feel humble in presence of another. Unconsciously, almost mechanically, I bowed down to touch his feet. Never do that, my child, he said, and lifting me up, he enfolded me in a warm embrace. His voice was musical as the song of a flute. His embrace claimed me as his own. It was an embrace whose bond will never be broken in this life or the next. After that, I met him again and again. If on a particular day I could not see him, I no longer gave much time to my studies. The thought of him claimed all the attention of my waking hours. And not unoften, he visited me at night in my dreaming. Who are you? I asked him one day. And he answered, I am a wayfarer, a pilgrim to the beloved's shrine. I am a seeker on the road to love. Whom do you seek? I seek him who rejoices in playing the game of hide and seek with those who love him. He is the ever revealed and the ever hidden one. One day, as we were walking through the marketplace of the town, he said to me, look, men are buying and selling things which are no better than trash, and they look so wise. Alas, they are forgetful of the richest treasures of life, the diamonds of the life divine. On another occasion, he said to me, he amongst men is a fool who does not realize the value of human birth. We have been born as men, not without a purpose. What is that purpose, I asked? To seek God, he answered, to seek him by day and by night, to seek him without ceasing. In your silence and songs, in your work and worship, seek him, without whom life is a meaningless muddle. If you go to the marketplace, seek him. If you enter a tea shop, seek him. If death comes to claim your body, do not give up your seeking, but say to him, Brother Death, do your work, I shall do mine. If you stay in a slum, let not the discomfort stand in the way of your seeking. If you have to dwell in a palace, let not its luxuries lure you away from seeking. Though you are offered the kingship of the world, refuse to have it if it will not lead you on in your seeking. How may I seek him? I asked. He may not be sought by the senses, he answered. He may not be reached by the mind, as smell may not be reached by hearing, nor color by touch. Beyond the senses and beyond the intellect, you must go. The senses must be withdrawn. The mind must be silenced. The clamor of desires and appetites must depart. Then may you make progress on the way of seeking. One day I brought him a copy of my Bhagavad Gita and requested him to write a few simple words which may be, to me, a guide to living. And this is what he wrote. Arise, awake, and walk the homeward way. Miguel, could you unmute and continue, please?
To return to my journeys towards Meher Baba, I had to proceed to Dehradun, a pleasant semi-hill station at the foot of the Himalayas, where Baba happened to be at the time of my arrival. For in those days, he was constantly moving around India. The train meandered through the scorched and dairy plain, stopping at nearby villages, where the peasants clustered round to stare at this curious lone white woman. At any rate, I was decently clad. If only American and English women could realize how much they have done to ruin the prestige of the Western world by their lack of modesty and decency. How badly they compare with the dignity, poise, and shy beauty of the Eastern girls. Why must stout elderly women with awful figures deck themselves out in the shortest of shorts? If they could only realize how utterly ridiculous they look. It is the looseness of our morals and the vulgarity of our mode of life that has contributed so much to the general disintegration of Western social life. I was astonished to see why women and girls in Indian hotels and on the golf course disporting themselves, a matter particularly repugnant to Easterners, especially in Muslim countries. After what seemed an interminable journey in the oven-like compartment, for it was in the hottest season, we at last arrived at Dehradun. As I looked out onto the platform, I saw two Western women. They were American disciples who had come to meet me. Strange to say, for no accountable reason, my heart sank. but they were most charming and took me to a hotel where, to my surprise, they informed me that Baba could not see me for the present, but wanted to know if I would go to America. But, I exclaimed, Baba has not even seen me. He does not know me. Baba does not have to see you to know you, came the reply. I felt very reluctant at the idea of going to America, fearing to be stranded and without funds owing to currency restrictions. It will be a risky undertaking in any case. However, in the end, after some time in Dehradun, I was persuaded. After all, a free trip to America and back again will be a most unexpected treat and not likely to be offered again. Also, I had in the meantime heard from Mrs. Rosenfeld that she might be able to do something for the children, since I had been unable to get them to South Africa. So there was a good personal reason for me to go to America, apart from Baba's wishes in the matter. While waiting at the hotel in Dehradun, I had a curious dream. I found myself sitting on the master's knees. He took my head and bent it slowly back till it touched the ground. Then he remarked, quote, "That is enough for now," end quote. Later, I asked one of Baba's disciples for an explanation. Quote, "Baba is changing your consciousness," end of the quote. Even before meeting the master, he may be at work on one's consciousness. After getting my papers in order for America, I proceeded to Ajmer, to which place Meher Baba had in the meantime moved. Here I was driven out to a large unfurnished house in the environs of the town. The house faced a motley looking lake where some cows were standing and a few women doing the washing. On being shown into a small room, bare of all furniture except for 2 chairs, I saw Baba, who was sitting on one. He was in the traditional white sadra and his hair fell neatly on his shoulders. I had the curious sense of having arrived at the end of my destination, my quest for truth, and felt that I was in the presence of a great spiritual being. It was an indefinable sensation. Before entering the room, I had been warned on no account to touch the master when greeting him. I learned later that this was not the general rule, but there were periods lasting from a few months to many months where Baba does not allow visitors to touch him, or even to bow down accordingly to the traditional Indian custom of greeting a spiritual personage. Baba does not himself explain the reason for this. Perhaps because we will not understand the spiritual import that signifies a perfect master's least onward action. But I feel we can be afforded a clue by referring to the quote-unquote shock experience of one of Baba's mandali recorded in the Wayfarers, which I will now quote. Quote, "Baba has never, as far as I know, explained why, When he sits with mass, he insists upon the rigid exclusion of everyone else. It is, however, possible from an experience related by Eruch, a close disciple, during the period of Chati Baba's stay at Bangalore, that there is a terrible physical danger in interrupting him at such a time. The two were closeted in silence in Baba's room for about 2 hours. And at the end of that period, Eruch, hearing Baba's movements to open the door, got up and released the class from the outside. Chati Baba then emerged and brushed past him on the way to his own room. As he went past, Eruch tells how he felt a palpable and excruciating shock pass through his body, similar, he says, to an electrical shock. There are many traditions in India about the danger of interrupting saints in the transcendental state of consciousness, and perhaps this experience was a sip of the dregs of power that had been at his highest potential while the two were in conference. Chati Baba was a very famous six-plane mast and had a considerable following of his own, since many recognized his high spiritual status. At the time of my visit, 1941, Baba was in very close seclusion and was no doubt working hard in the inner spheres of consciousness in connection with the world. For, so I have been given to understand, the avatar of the age is always the axis of the hierarchy, and therefore has the spiritual direction of world affairs and events to come. The short interview with Baba only lasted about 5 minutes. I felt no emotional instability, but I knew I was in the presence of no ordinary man. He is small and slight. One wonders how his body can contain such a force. His hands are strong and supple, with the long, delicate fingers denoting sensibility and spirituality, more commonly seen in the East than in the West. At that time, his hair fell neatly in his shoulders, but nowadays he generally wears it in a plait hidden behind his collar. I was so surprised at the freshness of his complexion, but then many Zoroastrians are fair-skinned. His dark, luminous eyes distinguish him from ordinary men. His nose is the outstanding feature of a remarkable and strong face, a face that can never be forgotten. It is long and aquiline, curving over his mustache.
Oh, please read the note too, Miguel. That's interesting.
Okay. The Persians are said to have originally come from Scandinavia. This will account for the fact that the Parsis are a light-skinned race in India. And giving him a decidedly Jewish profile, such as Jesus might have had. The features and appearance indicated a man of tremendous authority, such as one might expect of some very famous general. Also, there was that flawless dignity and serenity that is a characteristic of all the saints and marks them from another man.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Beautiful. Mayor, could you unmute and, or you are unmuted. Continue, Mayor, please. Mayor Kiran.
Yeah, thanks. I am told that Baba in his youth had a quite unusual beauty of face and form. That in fact he resembled Jesus. It appears that Baba's hair was the same deep auburn color. I have photographs of Baba when a young man with a beard, and on showing them to strangers, have heard the remark, he looks just like Jesus. If we read a description of Jesus given by Publius Lentulus, president of Judea, when writing an epistle to the Roman Senate, we see that his hair was the color of the chestnut, full ripe, plain to the ears. Whence downwards, it is more oriented to and curling and wavering about his shoulders. This might have described Baba as a young man when he wore his hair in the same fashion as Jesus. Baba tapped out on his letter board and he was happy to see me and that his spiritual connection with me was not of this life and that I should soon be aware of this connection, and not only would I know, but that I would be convinced. Nor was it necessary for me to tell him anything, because he knew me. He then proceeded to give me instructions to the effect that I should accept N's advice on spiritual matters.
I'm interjecting that I'm guessing that N is Norina, but I could be wrong.
I've heard that it was Norina.
Okay, thanks.
I've heard that. Yeah.
This woman, a close disciple, was a naturalized American and one of the 3 women obliged to return to the States because of the war. While I found her a most entertaining companion, I had already discovered that I could not agree with much regarding some of her views. So that it came as quite a shock to have Baba tell me to accept her as a kind of spiritual mentor. I protested quite vigorously, but Baba went on to explain that it was only in spiritual matters. In other matters, I could follow my own judgment. Anyway, the prospect was not too pleasing, and I also did not like Baba's extremely mischievous smile, which closed our interview. Oh dear, I thought whatever is going to happen to me in America. Again, my heart sank even more so as when my train drew into Dehradun station, I had in fact a most uncomfortable premonition that things might not turn out too well in America. I left Baba's presence feeling rather confused and certainly frustrated. To have come all this way just for this, it had been somehow quite a different interview from what I had expected. I had also hoped to ask some important questions which were worrying me, but the master had anticipated them and forbidden all questions to be asked before the meeting took place. Ignorant and uninitiated Westerners like my unworthy self are often under the impression that should we have the opportunity to see a master, we should attempt to profit accordingly by asking questions. The stupendous conceit of their finite mind, which is utterly unable to comprehend the all embracing infinite mind. Why cannot we be content, like Ishnus, with their age old affinity and understanding of the eternal varieties, to sit in silent contemplation and adoration when in the presence of divinity? Kabir warns us, ask not and ye shall be given milk, ask and you shall have but water, extract and you shall but drop blood. My stay in India was short, on that occasion. Nevertheless, I was to learn certain truths. That Dewey was right when he pointed out in his famous work, An Experiment in Time, that only the mind separates the past from the future, and the world of time and space is but a series of vanishing impressions. The real is that eternal world of unchanging reality. The real is not that which vanishes, but that which remains. Once or twice, perhaps thrice in my early life, I had been aware of a curious, impalpable sensation, a kind of awareness of my soul, a sense that deep within I had knowledge quite different from the surface mind. I knew this would come when I was standing on a great height, such as a mountain top, an indefinable feeling. This is something that could not be formulated since it was outside the mind and so impossible of expression. But it told me that this was not reality, for I would have a curious sense of unreality of my world, in fact, of the universe. It seemed as if the endless patience of the infinite mind had whispered to the finite mind, "You will not have to wait long. Someday you will know." And all this took place long before I had ever heard of Maya or the cosmic illusion or of Meher Baba. There are many remarkable stories associated with Baba, and all those close to him have stories to tell. I will relate just two of these. As I was now leaving for America and all my expenses were being arranged for, and since the visit to the States was to last 4 months, it seemed suitable. In fact, I felt it incumbent to make some small contribution for the purpose of the upkeep of Baba's charities, asylums, dispensaries, gifts to the poor, etc. Also for his traveling expenses, since Baba had no money and never handles it except certain occasions, as when giving to the poor. It so happened that I had an English check and also some old cash of exactly 83 rupees. I therefore asked Anne to give this to the master. She took the rupees and the check to Baba, who gave instructions that the rupees were to be given back to me as I might need some pocket money while waiting for the ship at Bombay. Here Anne, as I was later told, interrupted Baba, remarking that I was very extravagant, for had I not paid for an air-conditioned room at Calcutta? Baba cut her short, saying, "She will have 50 rupees left." Owing to wartime restrictions, the American liner was much delayed, and we were 2 weeks waiting at Bombay. Since all my expenses were paid for from the day I left Baba's presence, there was no need to spend any money except on the beggars that thronged the streets, and I had been told not to waste my rupees. The day before we were due to leave Bombay, Anne came and asked me whether I had any rupees left. If so, she would put them in the bank, since henceforth we would only need dollars. I emptied my purse and on counting the change observed, "I have just 50 rupees left." Here Anne gave a start of surprise. "Why, that is exactly what Baba said you would have left." Needless to say, I knew nothing of this and was just as astonished as she. So the master, in his terrifying omniscience, knew in advance down to the smallest detail, even about a little personal matter of insignificant consequence.
Thanks,
Just
Mayor. Very nice. Marianne, Marion, could you unmute, please? Thanks.
Just as we were leaving Bombay for New York, I wrote a letter to Baba. It was hardly the letter of a novice to a master, but more like that of a daughter to a father. I remember that letter was somewhat querulous, for Baba had stirred me up most uncomfortably, and I was now looking forward to the American trip with very mixed feelings. N was somewhat emotional, with all the ebullience of her Latin origin. She was disappointed with my lack of enthusiasm, nonchalant manner, and in short, that irritating British phlegm. As she looked upon herself as my spiritual mentor and seemed to think that the interview with Baba, short as it was, should have produced some transformation for the better. She was disappointed with me, according to her. Everybody meeting Meher Baba for the first time should have some form of illumination. Why had I not had any illumination? What had I felt? To which I would reply glumly, nothing at all. She worried me quite a little, so when I wrote to Baba, I took my revenge, making the request, quote, please give me a speck of illumination to keep N quiet, close quote. A few days later, I was standing on the deck, thinking of nothing in particular, and looking across the Indian Ocean, when suddenly, without warning, my eyes were filled with an inner radiance. It can only be described as the color of mother of pearl. It was all over in a flash, but I knew I had my, quote, speck of illumination. As mother of pearl contains all the colors of the spectrum, it was of a special significance to me. The reader might well ask, why was I sent to America? I can only reply that I really have no idea why I was sent and given a free trip to the States. Maybe Baba decided that he wanted me to learn something of life the hard way, or perhaps he knew that I was not likely to appreciate being cooped up in the women's ashram, since the men and women were always kept strictly separate, and on the whole, I preferred the society of men. Baba never discloses his purposes and never gives any explanations. Yet before I left India, I was told that he, when mentioning me to the women, remarked amongst other things, quote, she will do beautiful work for me in America. To this day, I have not the slightest idea what it could have been, but I am told that Baba sometimes makes use of us in some strange occult manner, while we remain quite unaware of what he may be doing. Chapter 8, America. As the ship drew into New York Harbor, I stared with goggle-eyed wonder at the towering skyscrapers that soared across the afternoon sky. The New World. Was it not said that America was God's last hope? The only land which had a really classless society in which opportunities were equal, and even the newspaper boy could dream of becoming a president of the United States. There stood the Statue of Liberty. When the French presented that great figure, it is said that Madame Blavatsky, who happened to be in New York at that time, asked where they would put it. Told that it would be placed on a rock in the harbor, she murmured, what a pity, it will go under the sea. It is difficult to say now what she meant or what she foresaw. Did she see the coming upheaval? Within a few days of landing, I found there was no hope to get the children to America, for the Yankee Clipper was booked up 18 months in advance. So there was nothing that Mrs. Roosevelt could do. Meanwhile, I discovered that we would not be able to return to India as all the shipping had become completely disorganized. For ships were being sunk daily outside New York Harbor. though America was not yet in the war. All sailings were now canceled, and the arrangement was that I should stay 4 months in the States and then return to India. What was I going to do? I was very worried, for it already looked as if I was going to be left stranded. The British consulate had already informed me I would have to go to Ellis Island. This was a prospect I did not relish, for I had heard unpleasant stories about that place. England was now at bay and almost alone. It seemed almost impossible that she could survive. I felt that I should return, but my home had been bombed and London was in flames. There was also no way to get back at that time. The British consulate said I might have to wait a year or more, and nobody knew what was going to happen. I was sharing a house with 2 of the Americans. The third had her own home in New York. We had been in New York a week. Frankly, I felt disappointed with the city, though the nights were wonderful with the illuminated skyscrapers and multicolored lights in the streets. One afternoon, feeling tired, I was resting on my bed. A photograph of Gerald reposed on the chest opposite. I was feeling frightfully depressed and anxious. How was he standing up to the war? For in Kent, where he was, there were almost daily air raids. As he had shell shock in the first war, I felt that the strain of it all would be terrible. In fact, I wondered if I should ever see him again. His chances of survival seemed remote. Then I suddenly perceived that a golden haze encircled the photo to a depth of some 2 feet. I looked again. This was strange. Glancing at the window, I saw there was no sunlight. The sky was overcast. I wondered if my liver was out of order. Certainly, my digestion had not been too good in New York. Later, getting up and going out, I thought no more about it. When I returned home, tired after losing myself, Anne rushed up exclaiming excitedly, quote, "What do you think, Irene, happened today? Baba came through the house," end quote. Knowing her tendency to romance, I replied cautiously, quote, "Indeed, how do you know?" Quote. She replied that after lunch, when resting in her room, she had seen Baba. I then remembered about my curious little vision. On my relating this, she explained that obviously Baba had passed into my room, read my thoughts, and put the golden aura round the photograph to show that Gerald was protected and would come through the war safely. And so he did. Later, when relating this story to a German-American friend, she told me how in the First World War, one of her friends, a certain Baron X, always knew who amongst his comrades in the German Air Force would return safely to headquarters after a combat fight. Those who would not had a gray aura round their heads, and those who were to come back safely had a golden one, yellow being the color of protection. I have heard other stories to the same effect. And regarded me as a child in spiritual matters, for at that time I understood nothing of Hindu metaphysics. And having been brought up on the normal Christian principles regarding the good, the beautiful, and the true, I was quite unable to make sense of what she called, quote, the long spiritual viewpoint. I was shocked. She upset all my previous values. I certainly needed shaking up but it was too strong meat for me. I jumped to the conclusion, from what she tried to explain, that Baba must be some sort of an antichrist. Had I made a wild goose chase all over the world for nothing? I wandered miserably around New York with a pain in my heart. Fortunately, I became friendly with a charming and intelligent girl who had heard of me from Professor Rhine during the time of my experiments with Professor McDougall. And through her own work with Rhine, she had done some very interesting work in the visualization of symbols. She too was interested in Meher Baba, but she had already come to the same conclusion as myself and was just as worried as I was. However, she was calm about it all and went into a long meditation on the master to try to ascertain his spiritual status. She came to me afterwards, and it seemed that she had been well rewarded, for Baba appeared to her in a vision with 3 halos round his head, such as are seen in certain pictures of the Buddha. Never again would she judge the master by any of devotees, for as we know, Baba uses all sorts of instruments for his work in all sorts of ways we cannot fathom. To get back to my problems, I wanted to return to South Africa, but owing to war conditions, my papers were not in order, so it seemed wiser to make for Australia, and in the meantime, I could not get away. I had the idea of going to a friend in California on whom I could depend, and from there I hoped to get to Australia, for in that country I could get all my funds, not allowed in America because of currency restrictions. First of all, I decided to take advantage of an invitation to the dear little town of Glens Falls and see something of the lovely state of New York. My hosts, the Shaws, were devotees of Baba, but people with very small means, yet they were incredibly generous, offering to keep me for the duration. This I could not accept, for how long would the duration of the war last? Nobody knew. But I can never forget the comfort of those parting words, quote, "If you don't get along in California, come straight back to Mom," close quote. My friend in California had been my governess at Oxford, and her daughter was now a film star in Hollywood. So I thought I should have no difficulty in finding them. On the way, I stopped in Washington, D.C., for when in New York, I had already received a kind letter from Mrs. Roosevelt, in which she had said she would not be able to come and see me after all, as she had changed her plans for the time being. I should mention I had a letter of introduction to the White House, given me by my old friend, Mrs. Dora Forbes, the president's aunt. The latter knew that I always wanted to go to America, and being an old lady, she thought perhaps that when the time for my visit came, she might be dead. This was the case, as she died in New York some months before I arrived in the States. However, I was hoping to see her sister, old Mrs. James Roosevelt, and to tell her my troubles, for she had written that she would be in New York in the fall. Then one evening, coming out in the streets of New York, I saw placards everywhere announcing the death of the president's mother. This cut off my one source of help. So I thought the only thing to do was to see the First Lady in Washington, D.C. I walked up and down outside the White House, trying to summon up courage to speak to the big man who guarded the gates. Should I tell him? And would he help me to see Mrs. Roosevelt? He had smiled benignly and I felt he would be sympathetic. But somehow my courage failed me, and I let the opportunity slip.
Thank you, Marion. Beautiful. Yeah. Slipped opportunities. We've had many of them. So we'll pick up here next week. This is page, let's see, let me check. 112.